Shabbat Shalom. As we conclude this week with another Shabbat, it's impossible not to think back to how this week began. For 11 hours, 4 people who walked into Congregation Beth Israel for their Shabbat service endured horrors that barely need recounting here. Praying, strategizing, and speaking calmly to the man with the gun who was holding them hostage. We've since read further details about the phone calls, the FBI agents, and the pastoral heroism of Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker. We were not there, and yet for hours on Saturday, we felt so close to the situation, glued to the television screens and refreshing browsers, safe outside of that synagogue. But spiritually, we were there. So many Jews around the world in solidarity with Rabbi Charlie and with the Jewish community of Colleyville. While the terror ended that evening, Shabbat was just giving way to a new week, during which Jews around the world had another reason for standing together, this time at Sinai. In the weekly Torah portion, Parshat Yitro, we read the giving of the 10 Commandments this week, an hour when we imagine that all Jews throughout time and space stand together. We read of how our ancestors stood at the foot of the mountain to receive the revelation of Torah, the moment when Israel came together as a people in relation to God and began an experience that would unfold over and over again in every generation after it. This past week, many in our community shared that watching the news of Colleyville felt like an experience that likewise unfolds, however bitterly, in every generation of our people over and over again. The feeling of being a target singled out for spurious claims about our role in society, a lie, the opposite of revelation, but something that feels ancient just as well. Here too, I'm reminded of our Torah portion, not just because of the collective moment at Mount Sinai, but because of what appears just before it. At the end of last week's Parsha, we read of Amalek, the eternal adversary of the Israelites, who makes his first appearance attacking the people in the desert. The very last verse of last week's Parsha reads, God will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, implying something eternal about the threats to our people from outside it. The name Amalek would become a metonym for anti-Semites thereafter in classical Jewish texts. And you could look at any contemporary experience of anti-Semitism through the prism of Amalek alone. But importantly, this week's Parsha gives us a different strategy. Parshat Yitro is named for the text's second most important leader, Jethro. In almost the same breath that the Torah describes war with Amalek, Exodus 18 begins with a verse. Now Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, God's people, how God had brought the people out of Egypt. These two verses, first about Amalek and then about Jethro, are so close to one another that they shout out a contrast between them. And Jethro, a leader of another non-Israelite people, plays a dramatically different role in the life of Israel in this chapter. When he sees Moses trying to adjudicate every issue that arose among the people all by himself, he points out that Moses could be leading much more effectively. Using the language of mitzvot, commandments, Jethro tells Moses that he must set up a court system with which he can share the burden of adjudication. Vayishma Moshe l'kol chotno, and Moses listened to his father-in-law and did as he said. There are certain literary cues that Jethro and Amalek are meant to be foils to one another. With Amalek, Moses chooses men for war, and with Jethro, he chooses men for justice. Italian scholar Umberto Cassuto points out that a number of other verbs mark these two episodes as the opposite of one another. Notably that with Amalek, the verb for war appears multiple times, and with Jethro, shalom appears instead. Rabbi Shai Held argues that this comparison between the two is a deliberate attempt on the part of the Torah to mitigate the fury that we might feel toward those who are not like us, lest we think that the non-Jewish world is exclusively antagonistic to us. The Torah goes out of its way to present this story, which is more or less a non sequitur in the narrative, to show us that in the life of our people, non-Jews play an invaluable role. In this case, they even shape our collective future. Over the past week, just as we have wondered anew about our role in society and our security in Jewish spaces, we've also seen an outpouring of support from non-Jewish leaders and peers. So many others who get it. People of other traditions and cultures who want to be in solidarity with Jews and with whom we can pursue a better future. This isn't quite a silver lining to the horrific events of last Saturday, but it is a fact that should feature prominently in how we assess our own security and where we feel we're headed as Jews. We need each other. Just as we need to understand that the attack on Congregation Beth Israel is something that we experience uniquely as Jews, we also need to welcome the love and support of the rest of humankind where we find it. Jethro was a non-Israelite, and his positive impact on Israelite life was essential to their well-being. It's significant that the Torah offers us the example of Jethro just as the people approach Mount Sinai. If everything in the Torah appears for a reason, the timing of this episode begs us to mine the meaning therein. And here, I'm reminded of a different text. In Ecclesiastes Rabbah, we read a rabbinic explanation for why Israel received the Torah here, chapters after the people had been freed from slavery. It might have made sense for the Israelites to experience the revelation of Torah immediately, once they were free to live in relation to God. But according to Rabbi Isaac in this midrash, God's delay in giving the Torah to the people is illustrated by a parable. And in this case, the parable goes that a king had a son who has just gotten up from being incapacitated by illness. The boy's tutor told his father that he should go back to school, but the king replied, "His good health has not really returned to him. Let him recover for 2 or 3 months, and then he can go back to school." In other words, God insisted that the people take their time to recover before receiving the truth of Torah. In their recovery from Egyptian bondage, the people needed to move beyond their trauma. If they were going to be able to build a new future, they needed some distance from their pain. They needed to see non-Israelites as something other than simply oppressors. The Midrash implies that we are only able to reach revelation, we're only able to access Torah when we feel secure. And the position of the Jethro episode teaches that this process is hastened when we approach outsiders with good faith, especially when they emerge to help us and live alongside us. In the aftermath of Colleyville, social media and talking heads have offered predictable hot takes about what the Jewish response should or should not be. But hot takes are probably not what we need right now. A few basic truths should be spoken. That the person who walked into Congregation Beth Israel was motivated by anti-Semitic assumptions. That anti-Semitism exists in various corners of our society, and it is our duty as Jews to name it. And that all animus toward minority groups, be they Jews or Muslims, Asian Americans right here in New York City, or anyone else, is also our responsibility to name and overcome. But above all, I think that what we learn from these texts, somewhere between Jethro and the revelation at Sinai, is that we need to give ourselves some space to consider our values. Specifically, to sit with our trauma and allow room for people who are not like us to be in solidarity with us as we figure out who we are. When we don't give ourselves room, we can't receive truth. because response is not revelation. And especially when we are quick to respond guided by fear, even when that fear is justified, we risk losing sight of the whole value system that makes us who we are. There is so much good in Judaism and in life that can only be revealed to us if we approach it without fear. The only hot take that really matters is the one offered by Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker himself this week. After sharing a bit about the education he received that allowed him to act heroically to protect himself and his congregation, he was asked on NPR what he would do the next time a stranger says, "I'm cold, can I have something to drink?" And he responded, "When someone comes to the door, they're nervous, they're questioning, they're asking, am I going to be accepted? And I want them to know that they're going to belong. We can't forget who we are. Amen, amen. Shabbat shalom."